First things first, let's make sure that you're in the right room. A show of hands, who cares about cloud costs, controlling your cloud costs, not overspending? Oh, most of you, so you found the right room. For those of you who did not raise your hands and therefore cost as no object, throw as much money as you can. Make sure you find me after this session and I'll introduce you to some sales reps who would love to meet you guys. All jokes aside, my name is Nick Orlove. I'm a customer engineer with Google Cloud. In a few minutes, I'm going to be joined with Elad Amit, who is the director of product development at PerimeterX, and we have a really exciting talk for you today. All right, so what we'll be going through is essentially the why and, more importantly, the how of cloud management, cloud cost management. We'll do a deep dive into how to tie your KPIs or business KPIs to those costs. Things like how much does it cost to bring on a new customer? How much does it cost to sell a widget or to get an extra pair of eyeballs looking at your ad or to click on a link, etc. We'll go through some real-world problems, some real scenarios on how to accomplish that. And we'll wrap it up with some best practices and Q&A. Speaking of Q&A, one of the exciting things that we have for this next session is something called Dory. So everyone, when we go to the Q&A segment, can ask questions online. This is open right now. So essentially, if you just open up your next app, go to the session, the CST 302, submit Dory questions through the plus sign, and then you can thumbs up, thumbs down Dory questions. At the end of this session, we'll have about 10 minutes or so for Q&A, and we'll be alternating between the Dory as well as the in-person mics. So definitely use that if it's convenient. Okay. So why analyze your cloud costs? I think the first reason is going to be pretty self-explanatory. Costs are directly tied to revenue of your business. It's a bit of a delicate equation here, and the most important part is costs do sometimes go up, but if costs go up, you also have to make sure that income is going up on par or preferably at a faster pace than costs. This is going to be critical to your overall business, but it's also crucial for each business unit and each team that contributes to these costs. So providing these business metrics, not only to CFOs, CIOs, et cetera, but also to those teams who are engineering and building these solutions is pretty powerful. Second is usage is directly tied to costs in the cloud world. With on-prem environments, truthfully, it was a little bit easier to manage costs because you bought one server, and that server essentially costs the same, roughly the same, whether you were at 0% utilization or 100% utilization. And so when you wanted your app to scale, you're really bound by that single server or X number of servers. And if you had wished it could multiply into multiple servers, it just didn't have that capability. With cloud, things operate differently in a good way. By things like auto-scaling, by being able to click and deploy new server instances, you can essentially grow your application from one server to 10 to 100 to 1,000 in seconds and minutes. But there's a slight caveat there, is that usage is tied to cost, and that as you use more resources, your costs increase. So much more important in this environment to actually keep an eye on how much your resources are costing you and being able to kind of turn that dial and adjust as you need the amount of resources that you have and the amount of costs that are contributing to your business. Third thing is being in control. So by monitoring your costs, you are the point of control for your business. You can determine how much you're spending on GCE, for instance, and how that's contributing to your business. You can keep track of what one business unit is contributing to a business versus another business unit, one team versus another team, one individual versus another individual, etc. Potentially who's running all those select stars in your business. And fourth thing is being intelligent. So the saying goes that data is the new oil, the new gold, etc. And that's very true. The more data you gather, the more that you can actually do with that data. So by actually collecting that data, by gathering it, you can do more advanced things like building dashboards that compare your costs to your KPIs, which we'll be going through during the session. But you can also do more advanced things like building ML models to predict what your costs might be in the future, or building ML models to potentially predict where you need to focus your efforts on product XYZ or widget ABC, etc. And most importantly is you will inevitably save money. So by actually monitoring your costs, you will be able to keep track of your costs and be able to tweak those spending habits over time. So I don't know if you've done this yourself, but a couple years back, I started more thoroughly analyzing my personal finances and was totally shocked to find out how much the occasional $5 cup of coffee or the occasional dinner out with friends, et cetera, actually ended up costing me at the end of the month. And so by keeping an eye on that, tracking that, and actually tailoring my spending habits, I ended up saving roughly about 10% per month in, once again, my personal finances. So by actually just keeping an eye and monitoring your spend costs, you will inevitably end up saving money. So let's take an example. Let's say that I just open up a new exciting bike shared company called G-Bike & Co. As you can see, I'm renting out these amazing Google bikes across the streets of San Francisco. Business is booming, ridership has gone up. I have more people becoming members, et cetera. But what I really want to do is start identifying how much my business is costing me and actually convert something like the number of bikes that are being driven or ridden across the street to an intelligent dashboard to show my bike trips are increasing while my costs are decreasing, stuff like that, actually providing more data to these numbers or these assumptions. And that's what we're going to do during this session. So first I want to talk about kind of the cost management 101, or what you can do right out of the gate immediately through the Google Cloud Console. First being built-in reports. So the Cloud Console has some fantastic built-in reports that allow you to actually tailor and drill down into specific projects, into specific environments to see what those costs are and maybe identify potential red flags, identify trends over time, et cetera. And by the way, all of these will kind of go through some quick demos in a couple minutes. Second being resource hierarchy. So rather than bundling everything, all your GCP resources into one quote-unquote bucket or one project, being able to intelligently separate one project for another. Maybe you have one business unit that's doing one thing versus another business unit, applying tags, using organizations, projects, folders, etc. For an example, my bike business, like I said, has been booming, but I'm interested in growing up a separate business unit. I'm going to be expanding into electric scooters. For everyone in San Francisco, there's one thing that we need more of, and that is electric scooters. So I'm going to be building this out, and I would essentially put that under a separate project so that I can more accurately compare business units between those two projects. Third being budgets and alerts. So in the Cloud Console, you can set specific budgets and alert on those budgets in a very granular level, so that if a project goes over a certain threshold or a billing account goes over a certain threshold, you don't have to be left in the dark and find out with that angry call at the month's end to find out why your project costs so much money. You can get that alert way before and start to dial down those knobs and actually control your costs. By the way, these aren't the only things for the Cost Management 101. Besides these kind of out of the box, you have a billing API to do some more advanced things. You can set quotas for your resources. We have a ML capability for actually recommending the specific machine types in GCE, stuff like that. So I definitely recommend kind of identifying all the different areas that you could go into this. But what we're really interested in this session is kind of more the advanced stuff beyond the 101. And so what I'm going to be doing is more pulling out a billing export from my Cloud Console, importing that into BigQuery, and then doing some analytics across it to identify potentially what my spend is, trends over time, et cetera. And BigQuery, being Google's fully managed data warehouse, allows me to do things like break down data silos, do some complex joins, some creative SQL, et cetera, so that I can actually bring in some of my business data, some of my KPIs, pull that into the same project or even a different project within BigQuery, join across that, and then kind of output some interesting reports through something like Data Studio or really pick your BI provider of choice, and provide these dashboards to management, to leadership, or even to teams and engineers to kind of get a better grasp of their spend. So I'm going to just real quick go through some of the 101 stuff. So on my screen, you can see I have the billing reports up. I'm looking at a range from the 25th to the 9th. By the way, all these are just kind of dummy numbers and stuff. This is an actual project, but the numbers that I'm going to be going through this demo are purely fictitious. So over here, in the projects, I can actually expand this to include multiple projects. So you can see this blue line being my production project, the next demo, my orange line being the test dev. I can also, instead of grouping it by project, I can group it by product. So you can see that the majority of my cost is going to Spanner, and then I have some GCE. I can further break it down by SKU. So I can find out exactly what my spends are over time. And I can even do some advanced drill down to kind of get a clearer picture of what the spend looks like. And in the previous image, you can actually see the trend line over time. Granted, this might not be the most accurate. Kind of depends on how much data it has that's feeding into it to make these projections. And because this project was started relatively recently, not the most accurate thing in the world. Besides that, I have budgets and alerts. So in here, you see that I have two separate alerts that are set. One for a $1,000 next demo, so at a specific project level, anything that exceeds a 50%, 90%, and 100% threshold, send me alerts on. I also have one for the billing account, so all the different projects within that billing account for a 5,000 limit. To create a budget, I can simply go to test dev. I'm going to pick my test dev project. I'm going to set it to be $100. Maybe $50 is a little bit too low to receive alerts on, so I'll change it to 80. And I'll click save, and there you go. Now all of a sudden I have a new budget that's been created, and that's going to alert me if my test dev team decides to go crazy and start spinning up a whole bunch of environments. Next is the billing export. So go here. There's two different ways to export your billing data. First is through BigQuery. This would be my preferred option. It means that you can do more with that data that's been exported. You can also export your data as a CSV. To export the data in BigQuery, it is an automatic everyday sync between your budget data and BigQuery. So what I would do is simply hit this edit settings, pick the project that I want to export my billing data into, the BigQuery data set that I want to export, San Francisco Bike Company. I'll click save, and there we go. Now it's enabled, and every day it's going to start syncing my billing data into BigQuery so I can do more advanced stuff with that. So let's go to BigQuery and see what that looks like. It roughly takes a handful of hours to get that first billing export into BigQuery. So what I've done is I actually have a billing export already in BigQuery itself. And if you look at this schema, you can see that it's capturing some pretty decent information. So I have billing account IDs. You can see what service or SKU I'm spending my money on, projects, labels, the specific location, whether you're running your GC instance in Asia or the US, total costs, usage, credits, all that kind of stuff. So some really good data. The challenge is that I want to make this more insightful and actually compare it to my business KPIs. And so for that, for my business data set or business table, I have this SF bike trips table in my data set. So by the way, this SF bike trips table is just essentially a copy of the public data set for the San Francisco bike. So by all means, feel free to kind of explore this yourself and have at it. For this data, essentially what I'm capturing is information on every single trip that my customers are taking. So I have the total duration of the trips, when the trip started and stopped and where. I have information on like whether that customer was a subscriber, i.e. like a monthly paid membership, or just someone who walked off the street and took a ride on my bicycle. And so what I'll do essentially is join these two tables with a simple SQL query. I think everyone can still see that. And so essentially what I'll do is a join between these two tables. So I have this SF bike trips table first off. And what I'm pulling out of this table are the relevant information for me. So I have the number of trips, where I'm counting the total number of trips per day, total duration, the date itself. I'm counting whether the customer was a subscriber or just an off-the-street customer. And then I'm joining that to my billing export. And from my billing export, all I'm doing is pulling out the particular day and the total cost per day. So you can see that this is relatively simple, but you can take this to the next level of potentially which areas are the most profitable for me with this bike data. That might tell me maybe I should start placing more bikes in a particular area or remove bikes from other areas. It might break into things like maintenance, and I could do joins across multiple tables and identify, okay, I have a team of 5 people who do maintenance on these bikes. Where do I need to send them to be a little bit more strategic with this? And so I'll go ahead and click Run Query. And you can see, once it finishes, you can see that the query has broken out the total number of trips. I'll just hide this. Total number of trips and compared it to the cost. So on average, I have somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 trips per day. My subscriber numbers seem to be pretty healthy. My total cost per day, once again, totally fictitious, is, I don't know, somewhere between $20 and $30 per day. So it looks pretty good. However, the challenge is that to my just normal human eyes, I can't really spot trends in this data. So what I would do is actually open this up in Data Studio. So there's this a fantastic Explorer in Data Studio button that's going to open up a net new Data Studio project. But let me just show you the one that I've already created. This took about 5 minutes, so it's incredibly easy. And what I have is a couple different data points. So first, let's look at this cost versus KPI dashboard up here. And the blue line you can see are the total number of trips. And so there seems to be like a pretty common trend here where maybe bikes get ridden more during the work days and then less during the weekends. People are riding their own bikes, stuff like that, hanging out with their kids, etc. on the weekends. Makes sense. And you can see that the red bars are my total cost per day. Now, what I didn't tell you earlier is that I've actually started a new initiative to find out if I can adopt more bike riders with, let's just call it a mobile app. And so I started spending more money on this mobile application somewhere around mid-February. And you can see that my costs have increased. However, the blue line, the total number of trips, haven't really increased. In fact, there's some interesting dips. I mean, potentially maybe it was rain or something like that. But right out of the gate, you can kind of see that maybe this business initiative isn't really as successful as I first planned it to be. And so I can look at these numbers down here below, which kind of summarize the total numbers across the month. And this actually proves my point, is that GCP costs per month have risen by 55%, kind of a warning sign, unless the bike trips have also increased, but they're actually down by 6.2%, so a little concerning. The subscribers are also down, and my non-subscribers have only increased by 1%. So right off the bat, I can take this data to my business, to CFO or CTO, et cetera, and kind of show them that maybe this trend or this business initiative really isn't panning out as much as possible. So this is more of a kind of theoretical exercise, more of like the book smarts. I'd like to invite Elad Amit on stage to talk through more of the street smarts of actually putting this into practice and all the business value you were able to contribute back to PerimeterX.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that great intro. Nick, like you said, my name is Elad Amit. I'm the Director of Platform Development over PerimeterX, where my team is primarily in charge of scaling our product. And one of the things that entails is cost management. Just for the context, what we actually do is something called bot mitigation. That is, we ingest a boatload of traffic, we analyze it, and we use it to block all sorts of malicious traffic. Stuff like account abuse, account takeover, credit card theft, all sorts of nasty little things. And the problem is that a boatload of traffic costs a boatload of money. So naturally, we try and give it the attention it deserves. Now, I know you were promised a demo, but instead, what I'm going to do is tell you a story. Switch to the demo. It's really a demo. Now, like every good story, we have characters, and our specific story starts with our CFO, who was actually quite angry with us at the time, and rightfully so. I mean, all he wanted to know was what our cloud bills are going to be like at the end of the month, and though that may sound like a trivial question, this was like 2 years ago, and 2 years ago, what we mostly had was old flat file export that looked kind of like this, with very, very little dimensions that we could kind of figure out what we were doing. And though, as Nick showed you like a second ago, these days you already have these nifty little projections that you can understand what's going on. At the time, they didn't exist. For us, the real turning point was when we started using Do It and their tool called Reoptimize to kind of start figuring out a little bit better where we're going to be at. This is specifically reoptimized with some projections that you can see here. At that point, our CFO was quite happy, but as we grew and as we matured, people started asking some really weird questions. I mean, up till then, people asked, how much is stuff going to cost? And at that point in time, people started asking, how much is my stuff going to cost? This was like this totally blew our mind. So as we went into the billing export that Nick showed you a second ago, what you can see at the default that you're getting is mostly semantics based on what Google is selling you. I'm not saying that as a negative thing, because that's actually what you're paying for. But if you can see here, then what you're mostly seeing is stuff like custom instance, yada, 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 containers this, active storage that, and making the leap from that to whatever it is that you're building is somewhere between hard and impossible. Now, thankfully enough, at that point, this was like a year and a half ago, the billing exports started getting the user-defined labels pushed into them, and surprisingly enough, they were always there. We were using them mostly for operational stuff to kind of break down what we were using within production. And not surprisingly enough, we wanted to use the same breakdown to kind of figure out where our costs were going. To kind of simplify our lives a little bit, we chose to expose this additional data using a view, mostly because we wanted to take away the complexity, and you'll see the complexity a little further down the line, of how to figure out which specific dimensions are really interesting and which are not. Now, specifically within this view, you're going to want to notice two things. The first of which is that we're exporting a column called Partition Time. This basically allows the BigQuery query or Data Studio querying BigQuery to prune the partitions and make your queries a little bit cheaper. For us, the billing data set is already around 2 terabytes, so it adds up and it makes sense. And the second thing you're going to want to notice is that we're trying to take away the complexity of unnesting repeated fields. If you're going to be using this, I highly recommend you read up on unnested fields, because you can make really, really bad mistakes with them. So what we have here specifically is a summary of the amount of credits and the specific label that we want to use. And if we go back to our Data Studio reports, then we can see that once we break down our cost based on this new billing component that we've added, then the semantics here change completely from what Google is selling to what we are actually building. Here we can see how much this specific front-end component is costing us, how much this specific Elasticsearch cluster is costing us. And this isn't just like the cores or the RAM or any specific piece, it's everything. The other nifty little thing that you get when you add this is that you can now not only see the overall spend or just by SKU or by component. Once you break down a specific component by the SKUs, then you can figure out where to focus your development efforts on optimization, which is what this whole talk is about. So if you take, for example, that online component, then we can see that it is mostly a CPU-intensive resource. You can see this is custom instance core in America, the Virginia, if I remember correctly, and so on and so forth. And to contrast that, we have this little thing, which is mostly a network-intensive resource. Now, another thing to notice is that while you would have probably gotten this from operational dashboards, you would have not gotten the fact that it is using network which is that much more expensive. For those of you who have already been using GCP or pretty much any other cloud provider, you know that not all networking costs the same. Some of it costs nothing. This specific thing costs a lot. So naturally, we wanted to optimize it. And if we go further down the line, you can also see that throughout roughly the last 5 to 6 months, we've actually focused our development efforts on bringing this network cost down. And you can see how this nice little line keeps dropping and dropping and dropping. And this kept making our CFO happier and happier, which is a lot of my job. Now, somewhere along this point in time, you're probably going to try and squint and figure out whether all these lines really mean what I say they meant. And surprisingly enough, we had the exact same problem. It's called cognitive load. When you look at a graph with like 50 lines trying to explain what your networking cost is, another 80 trying to explain what your CPU costs are like, you're going to have a hard time. And graphs should be easily read. At this point, we're going to jump back to our marvelous little view, and we're going to augment it with a case clause, specifically this. Now, what we were doing here actually is we were taking the different SKUs and trying to group them into slightly more coherent groups. What you'll see here is various commitments, preemptible cores, RAM, and all sorts of networking stuff. We chose to do this and not join it with a lookup table, mostly because we have zero control over the actual SKUs going into the system, because they're controlled by Google. And throughout the last couple of years, they have changed every once in a while. And what was more important to us was to have these groups as stable as possible. And now, if we go back here and we look at the graph by this nifty little SKU group, then you can see that indeed I was not lying through my teeth, and that the main cost, insanely so, is this purple little line that kept going down and down and down. Again, making a lot of people happy. At this point in time, you're probably gonna try and ask me what happened in October. And sneak preview, we did not get a bunch of coupons that we entered into the system, dropping our costs. About 2 weeks before this point in time, we got a lot of people starting to complain about how they were losing the bigger picture. And, they were quite right. We went from very coarse kind of SKU and product-based information all the way down to the specific billing component with nothing in between. So at that point in time, naturally, we started adding more and more labels onto our resources to get more information. Unfortunately, we kind of missed this little piece of the documentation, which basically says that once you cross the 1,000 unique label value line, it starts discarding them. So the end result was a complete loss of visibility because it kept the labels that we weren't actually interested in. And then obviously we fixed it, but being aggressive people, we wanted to both have what we wanted and still have the whole thing work. So we went back to our view again. Have I mentioned how much I like this view? And here we decided, let me just make this a little bit more readable. Here we decided to join that billing component that we had with a slightly smaller data set, which is just going to be those enrichments that we added before, since they were relatively kind of static. For those of you in the data warehouse business, this is kind of like a star schema, but not really. So here we added stuff like which product this specific company was serving, which serviced, a few general details, whether it was production or non-production, whether it was manually scaled or auto-scaled, and a bunch of other stuff that I'm not going to mention here because I don't want to dive too deep into it. And then, if we again go back, we can see that we can now bunch stuff up into those, let's call them Uber services. And the difference here in terms of what you can do with your development efforts is that if you usually looked at just like a single component, then you're going to be doing some local optimizations. Here you can look at a much broader spectrum. And for example, imagine that this kind of said for your life front end or API or something of the like. And here you can start thinking about slightly more cross-cutting changes, like using a different protocol or looking at a different processing mechanism. Now, at this point in time, this was like, I don't know, 2 months ago, 3 months ago. We were ecstatic. Everything was great. We were really, really happy. And then this came along. Needless to say, a 13% increase in costs is not a good thing for anyone and really, really makes most people angry, especially when you keep telling them that everything is improving. Or is it? And the problematic part is that life doesn't exist in a vacuum, especially your costs. And at that point in time, we were growing at an insane rate. And we didn't want to be the guys who kind of raised the wrong flag. So we wanted to kind of improve how we were looking at things and try to take out that noise within the signal that we were looking at. And the way that we chose to do this is start looking at relative figures instead of the absolutes. If you remember, up till now, we looked at dollars. And what we decided to look at was the relative cost of pushing 1 million page user requests through our system. And by that, kind of try and take out the traffic fluctuations. The way that we did that, back to our marvelous view, was once again join the billing data with some more business metrics that were already there because we run a business and we need to know how much traffic is coming through. And once we took this information and moved back to Data Studios, you can see, or like what all of you can do as well, you can add something called a calculated field, in this case something quite simple, in case you're not being able to see this. This is like the final cost divided by the amount of traffic, and then when you look at it, things start to make slightly more sense. Over here you can see that, as I mentioned before, everything is fine, cost is indeed going up, but our cost efficiencies are going down. Again, this makes most of the people happy on our end. Just as an example, if we take another look at the service we looked at before, this is the same cost efficiency metric for that service. And you can see that indeed it has went down with this day being a party that we threw when we went down that low. To kind of try and summarize our experiences from the last couple of years, I think what I want to leave you with is 3 things. The first of which is label everything. And when I say everything, I mean like everything at least once. Probably not more than once, because that'll be bad. But even if you don't see the value in it now, you're really going to want to label it, because further down the line, when stuff does grow, you're going to lose that history, and that never comes back. The second is that human beings are inherently good, and when you show them this information, you're probably going to be surprised with the amount of negative emotions that they're going to throw at you. What we've found is that this is mostly because it's a muscle most people do not flex that often. I don't know, a lot of societies that teach their children how to manage budgets well or deal with money. And the more that you connect the money end of things to what they're actually building and what they are good at and practice a lot, for example, the billing components or the actual traffic and the business metrics, then the more they're going to be willing to take this as something that they're in charge of. And the third, SQL is your friend. A billing invoice for us right now is somewhere between 6 and 7 million lines in the billing export. There's no way that you're going to be able to understand what's going on there without reporting and aggregations. And that's what SQL is for. And with that, I turn the mic back.
Yeah.
Nick.
And can we switch back to the slides? So Elad, you're absolutely right. Making your CFO happy is critical. I'm sure everyone has to kind of figure that out themselves. Besides your 3 takeaways, I also want to add in my 4 takeaways actually for best practices for everyone who has graciously attended this session. First being on day 1, not day 30, day 90. On day 1, start exporting your billing data into BigQuery so that you can start building cost analysis dashboards, so you can actually have that data in the first place, so that when potentially problems arise, when your spend increases beyond what you were expecting, you have that data so that you can actually go back in, do some analysis, you know exactly where that data is, you already have your dashboards, all that stuff, instead of in the heat of the moment trying to collect that data, figure out where all of it is, and then run through all these SQL queries and stuff like that. So start capturing it on day one. Second thing is structure and organize your projects, your organizations, your folders, your labels, all that stuff across all of your different GCP resources. So Elad, you're 100% right. By just throwing everything into one single project or not using labels doesn't really give you any kind of fine-grained control over what you're spending on and how those spends are affecting your business, etc. So make sure that you start actually using resource hierarchies, labeling assets, putting items into projects, into folders, all that stuff. Third is make sure that you're configuring the right kind of policies for the right kind of people who have access to control costs, to set budgets, to set alerts, all that kind of stuff. So rather than just giving free rein to everyone to start spending as much as they want, maybe you have like department heads or something like that, or you use things like Google Groups where the production team has more control over spending habits than the dev test team, something like that. So that spend doesn't go out of control and you start trying to scramble and find out what happened when. And fourth is building a culture of show back in your org. I've talked to a bunch of different customers about this. Some customers call it shame back. I'll kind of let you guys decide on which culture fit is right for your company. But essentially, the ability to regularly review these billing reports and custom dashboards with your teams, with your business units, etc., and then regularly setting up budgets and alerts so that you can closely monitor your costs and you can alert stakeholders when costs start to increase, things start to become concerning, what have you, so that you can catch the train way before it leaves the station.